Opinions are like receding hairlines past the age of 30. Everyone has one. What do you mean not everyone is scared of 5 miles per hour winds? The point is that opinions are aplenty, and there's plenty of critical opinions that just don't match what players think. Hello viewers, it's good to see you. I'm Will from Cultured Vultures, and these are the video game equivalents of Equilibrium only having 40% on Rotten Tomatoes. 40%, that does actually make me quite emotional. Die! This probably is the most famous example of all times of critics not having their finger on the pulse. God Hand was the swan song for Clover Studio, the Capcom subsidiary responsible for some of the biggest cult hits on the PS2 and GameCube. Both Beautiful Joe and Okami were beloved by critics, but for some reason failed to achieve any real commercial success. This led Capcom to shutter the studio after the release of God Hand in Japan and North America. The departures of key Clover talent like Atsushi Inaba, Hideki Kamiya, and Shinji Mikami also forced Capcom's hand to a degree. Upon God Hand's launch, the devilishly difficult beat-em-up received almost the exact opposite treatment from critics than other Clover Studio games had, with the now infamous 3 out of 10 review from IGN being the most famous example. While other critics were a little more favourable, especially once the UK games media got hold of the game, God Hand was far from the critical darling that Okami was. Its intense difficulty and bizarre kitsch aesthetic invoked a love or hate reaction from critics. As for the gaming public, God Hand is still considered to be a wee bit divisive, as the game can often demand a lot in terms of ability, but those who vibed with God Hand's ridiculous nature found arguably the best beat-em-up on the PS2. The reputation of God Hand turned around so much so quickly that even IGN featured the game on their best PS2 games list, which is not as good as our list, bozos. We win! Amazing. Amazing. It is hard to see any other destiny for Deadly Premonition than it being a bit of a misunderstood and somewhat even maligned masterpiece. If you're starting with Twin Peaks as your main inspiration, which is a core pillar of my personality, then you're going to end up with a game that people are either going to love or hate, or both, as is the case that happened to me with a lot of critics who had the unfortunate job of reviewing Deadly Premonition. An ambitious game, Deadly Premonition blended survival horror with an open world, as NPCs and facilities in the town of Greenvale operated on a 24-hour cycle, meaning players had to be in the right place at the right time of day in order to continue their investigation into the town's murderer. Between the odd story, the janky gameplay, and the frankly bizarre characters and mechanics, Deadly Premonition caught a lot of flack when it was launched, though some critics found joy in the game's more eccentric tone. As for the wider public, Deadly Premonition never really achieved enough success to be called more than just a cult hit. But those who fell in love with the game's idiosyncratic nature fell hard. What helped Deadly Premonition's reputation is the acceptance of what some might consider flaws actually being deliberate design choices. Though DP's redemption arc couldn't save the sequel from being lambasted by pretty much everyone, because it does genuinely feel like this game was made by aliens. Are we stretching the conceit of this a little bit to include Alien Isolation? Perhaps, as Alien Isolation received plenty of acclaim when it launched in 2014. Oh my god, that was 10 years ago. You could even argue that Isolation's success and popularity with the broader gaming public, and most noticeably streamers, was responsible for the survival horror renaissance we're currently experiencing right now. So the 79% on Metacritic feels like almost a crime. In truth, it's not about how many critics disliked Alien Isolation when it originally launched, as plenty thought the game was fantastic. It's more about who, as the big outlets such as GameSpot, IGN and Polygon were a lot more scathing in their critique than others. Those who weren't keen on the game found Isolation's campaign too long, while stating that Alien Isolation also suffers from some uneven pacing. Those criticisms about Alien Isolation's length might have some weight to them, especially when you're stuck fighting androids for a decent chunk of the game. But when the Xenomorph shows up on screen, that's when the real magic of Isolation comes out, as an AI enemy driven to hunt down the player instead of appearing as a series of scripted sequences. There's a unique sense of terror when it comes to dealing with the Xenomorph. It's the memories created by the Xenomorph which has stuck with players for a long time, as well as how badly IGN biffed it in their review. It just needed a bit of water and they may have passed out from rage.
Neutralized! Shoot those gas canisters! More drones!
Licensed games are bad, but sometimes they're not bad, etc, etc. Yes, there are some notable exceptions, with GoldenEye 007 possibly being up for the consideration of one of the best FPS games ever made, but when you're up against competition like that, it's hard to get any actual groundswell for yourself. It's probably why Terminator Resistance met plenty of resistance when it launched in 2019. Developers Teon hadn't done themselves any favours before Terminator Resistance, as their most notable launch before that was Rambo, the video game, an on-rail shooter that was about as much fun as being the guy in Rambo First Blood who takes a spike trap to the shins. Critics most likely expected the same when it came to Terminator Resistance rolling around, and in truth, it's not like Resistance is the best shooter in the world either. Critics panned the unoriginal gameplay and deemed it boring. Harsh. What fans seem to recognise is that it wasn't trying to be the best shooter ever made. Resistance is simply trying to be the best Terminator game ever made. As bars go, being the best Terminator game is one that you could just step over instead of jumping. But Resistance still knocked it out of the park by showing a clear love and appreciation for the source material. It is the love for 80s action films that helped Teon land the RoboCop license, which pretty everyone much agrees is a janky but lovable Slaughterfest. And you can't talk about janky Slaughterfest without talking about a Drakengard spiritual successor. Saying that Nier is a game that critics hated in the year of our Lord 2014 seems like blasphemy. When Nier Automata launched, the gaming press were falling over themselves to heap praise on a game that was lauded as an all-time classic. And they were right to do so, of course, as Nier Automata is a certified banger. But when the original Nier launched on the PS3 and Xbox 360, reviews weren't nearly as kind. Is it a better game than Automata? No. But it's definitely a game that deserved more than a 67% on Metacritic. An action RPG that's been redeemed with time, the original Nier was about obscure as it got when it originally launched, considering that the whole series is a spin-off to one specific bad ending from the original Drakengard. Just wrap your head around that for 1 minute, I'll wait. While critics had plenty of great things to say about the story, which combined hard-hitting emotions with the usual Yoko Taro gimmick of multiple playthroughs that reveal new layers as you repeat the cycle, the gameplay wasn't for everyone. From the beginning, Nier has tried to blend character action-esque combat with bullet hell shenanigans, and while Platinum perfected the execution with Automata, those ideas and mechanics can still be found within the original Nier, and they were good enough to launch Nier into cult classic status almost immediately. Of course, they were improved upon even further with the remaster Nier Replicant, that also focused more on the experience those in Japan received. But if you want to experience the original game for yourself, you can easily pick up an Xbox 360 copy and play it through backwards compatibility, and see that Nier, far, wherever you are, it's still a great game.
Any idea how many?
Keep focusing on Surkov. That's where they're headed.
When thinking about Alpha Protocol, that one quote from Wreck-It Ralph comes to mind. I'm bad, and that's good. I will never be good, and that's not bad. Shakespearean level stuff, no doubt. You have to walk a fine line in the gaming industry in order to become a game that reaches the elite echelon of so bad it's actually good. Alpha Protocol doesn't do so much walk that line as it does tap dance over it in the tune to Spanish Flea. Obsidian's attempt to create an RPG in a similar vein to Mass Effect and Deus Ex, Alpha Protocol follows Agent Michael Thornton as he travels around the world trying to stop terrorists by any means necessary, sometimes even with words. Gross! In a manner similar to those other RPGs, players are given full control over Thornton's skills and dialogue options, with those choices leading to huge consequences down the line. Alpha Protocol isn't a good game by any stretch of the imagination, with the core gameplay being as messy and janky as it gets. But that's fine, because it's also unquestionably ambitious, silly, and in some ways genius too. You just have to dig through a lot of flaws in order to get there, which ultimately leads to the game's disparity between critical reception and player reception. When it's your job to look at a game critically and take into account any flaws, of course you're going to find a bit more negative about a game like Alpha Protocol, while players are more willing to forgive those flaws. Long may the cheese reign. If you've seen any other retro content from us, you're probably wondering if we'll ever shut up about Urban Reign, that one PS2 beat 'em up from Namco, and of course the answer is never. Urban Reign is daft and brilliant, and the more people that know about its gloriousness, the better. When people are still uploading combo videos nearly 20 years after the game's launch, you know you've got something special. However, if you were reading reviews regularly during the mid-2000s, you probably would have been put off from Urban Reign thanks to its less than ideal critical reception. Sitting at just 60 on Metacritic, Urban Reign feels like a story of failed potential. The Tekken developers deciding to make a 3D beat 'em up in their time off sounds like a recipe for success. But with reception peaking at mediocre, Urban Reign was always designed to be overlooked. What's more interesting though is that those reviews aren't wrong either, as the majority spoke about how the game's single player mode becomes both repetitive and brutally hard after a while. 100 missions is about 50 too many for a game like this, while anyone who's played Urban Reign to completion will definitely shudder at the mere mention of the name Golem. While the single player portion of Urban Reign isn't anything to write home about, unless you're writing to your therapist about Golem kicking your ass again, the core gameplay is what makes Urban Reign special. The inputs are incredibly simplistic, and there's a robust array of systems and mechanics that make Urban Reign shine. And it's been way too many days since we saw the release of a remaster or even port. Did Days Gone receive negative reviews from critics just because the main character is called Deacon St. John? Because that is fair enough, honestly, though saying the reception for Days Gone was negative isn't the whole truth. Sitting around 70 on Metacritic, it's clear that there's some genuine love for Ben Studio's open world zombie adventure. While some think that it's an underrated cult hit, it actually sold over 8 million copies for good reason. However, Days Gone actually drew ire from a lot of reviews because they thought it didn't do anything that gamers hadn't seen before. The open world zombie game genre is a path well trodden at this point, meaning that Days Gone didn't seem like quite an original premise. Perhaps the more damning indictment of Days Gone though was the fact that it was released about a year after God of War, and while another open world PlayStation game, Death Stranding, released in the same year. For critics, Days Gone was the middle part of a PlayStation Studio sandwich. Meanwhile, the general player base was much more forgiving to Days Gone, with the core gameplay loop and spectacle of the zombie or freaker hordes becoming one of the biggest highlights. Credit where credit is due, Days Gone is probably the first game since Left 4 Dead that managed to make a zombie horde terrifying, so it's no wonder the devs gave Deacon a bike for the majority of the game. Get me as far away from those freakers as possible, thank you. You can get yourself towards a 35-minute review of this game that Jimmy did, that like 17 of you watched, if you can be asked.
I'll make you do it all night, lover.
Stay down.
Maybe.
So do you want to hear a true miscarriage of justice? The PS2 version of Spider-Man Web of Shadows has a better Metacritic rating than the PS3 and Xbox 360 version. Yes, the PS2 version, dubbed the Amazing Allies Edition, which plays like the worst 2D beat-em-up you've ever encountered and ends with a text box that just says, "Congrats, you've saved the city," and has a higher rating than a genuinely great open world adventure game. Sure, the difference is only 1 point, but it's still worth mentioning, and now I have. Anyway, after Treyarch managed to revolutionise what it means to be a Spider-Man game with the release of Spider-Man 2, before it bungled it entirely with the third game, the bulk of Spider-Man Web of Shadows development fell to Shabba Games, who tried to do things a bit differently. Web of Shadows is still an open world adventure game, of course, but Shabba introduced moral dilemmas and decent, mostly original story into the mix to create something new. At the time, reviewers weren't that kind to Web of Shadows. There was a particular scathing review from Eurogamer, which mentioned ridiculous padded mission objective and some dodgy camera work as the game's biggest blunders. And the public were far more kind to the biggest swings that Web of Shadows took with the game's combat and story. Compared to the Insomniac titles, Web of Shadows feels almost like a character action game, and we love it for that. It's still a mystery to us why this game doesn't have much love. Arguably the biggest difference between critic and fan reception on this list, reviewers really did not like Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Sky when it originally released. In all fairness, they weren't kind to Explorers of Time or Explorers of Darkness either, but Explorers of Sky was supposed to be the definitive edition of the two sister games, adding new content and story beats to flesh the game out. So why did it earn 5 less points on Metacritic? Reviewers lambasted Explorers of Sky as they felt the game didn't do enough to really improve on the flaws of the original. Besides adding some additional content, and with the core gameplay loop remaining pretty much the same in this version, Explorers of Sky was raked over the coals by critics with a 54 on Metacritic. You'd think this was a DS game you should avoid at all costs, but the general public would disagree. While most of the over 6 million plus players who have enjoyed either Explorers of Time, Darkness or Sky might have opinions on whether or not it's the best game in the series, it's almost universally agreed that Explorers boast the best narrative. Sky in particular serves its purpose as the definitive edition of Explorers, thanks again to reams of extra content, including new playable Pokemon and additional chapters. Meanwhile, arguing that Pokemon is repetitive is like getting mad at the sky being blue. All you're doing is taking turns fighting and denying that Sudowoodo is not the greatest Pokemon of all time, right? Thank you for joining us for the banger games that critics hated. But what games did you love that the critics hated? They don't have to be banger, they can be terrible, I'd just like to know. Drop it in the comments down below. And don't forget, if you want to hear more from me and Silly Boy Jimmy, like and subscribe. Peace out, word to your mother.